because sometimes by doing those assumptions you're ending up solving a problem that no animal ever is solving. You've just changed the problem completely. So it's no longer general because it doesn't apply to any real system. So the short answer is insects definitely learn, and we know that for sure, so that it's not just instinctual. It's amazing what an amazing little machine this thing is, isn't it incredible? And feel quite bad about actually just pushing it.
Hi everyone, this is Axel. You just heard the voice of Dr. Barbara Webb. Barbara is a professor of Biorobotics in the School of Informatics at Edinburgh. She leads the Insect Robotics Lab in the Institute for Perception, Action and Behavior. This episode is all about insect robotics. After giving Barbara some really difficult philosophical questions to answer, we discuss how robot models can be used to test hypotheses in biology. Most of the episode we discussed the incredible things crickets, ants and the insect brain region called the mushroom body can do. Barbara also tells us how insect robotics can inform embodied AI, predictive coding and reinforcement learning. As usual, we finish off with some career questions and her future projects. If you want to jump ahead to specific questions, there are timestamps in the description. Hi Barbara, it's great to have you here. What sparked your interest in robotics?
So I studied psychology as an undergraduate and got very interested in the brain and how brains control bodies and our sensory systems and motor systems. And in a way, robotics was a way to explore that by trying to recreate it. So essentially, robotics is the equivalent problem that you have to solve to have something that senses stuff and acts on stuff. So that was one route. I guess the other thing that did actually influence me as well was I did my PhD in artificial intelligence, and at the time that I did that, it was very fashionable to take the attitude that you couldn't really get intelligence without it being physically embodied. So, and that meant a robot. So Rodney Brooks was one of the people who was quite influential at that time, who basically argued that, we've gone about artificial intelligence all wrong and we should start by trying to understand how things could act in the real world was really essential, and that you hadn't built an artificial intelligence unless you'd actually implemented it in a physical robot. So that was kind of influential as well in forcing me towards using robots in the work I was doing in my PhD.
Awesome. So we'll start off with a fun question. What would it take for a robot to understand the concept of a chair the way we humans do?
I'm not sure I can answer that question because it requires knowing what you mean by understanding. But perhaps what you're getting at a little bit there is what is the concept of a chair? A chair is something you can sit in. So then for a robot to understand the concept of a chair, it might be enough to say, well, if it's able to identify things that it can sit on versus things that it can't sit on, that would maybe be sufficient. But whether it would actually have a concept, I think that's a bigger issue about self-awareness and consciousness and language, which I'm not an expert on.
I'm going to give you two more maybe impossible philosophy questions, and then we'll talk about your insect robotics work. So for the first one, last episode, when I had Ron Chrisley, I heard the term affordances for the first time, and I looked it up and I found that it came from the 20th century psychologist James Gibson. And watching one of your videos, I noticed you mentioned Gibson, so I think you're familiar with him. Could you maybe tell us a bit about his concept of affordances and maybe how it could be related to robotics or is related to robotics?
Yes, so Gibson's idea of affordances was really that when we perceive the world, we don't perceive flat colors and shapes and so forth, but even we don't perceive 3D objects as such, but what we actually perceive is what we can do with those objects. So we perceive the world as something we can interact with. We perceive the size of a doorway and whether we need to turn sideways to get through a gap, and we perceive whether something can be picked up easily in our hand or whether it's something that we would need both hands to pick up and so forth and so on. Or we perceive that something would cut, if we pick this thing up it would cut something else. So we perceive the actions, we perceive objects in terms of the actions we can perform on them, I think is the essential thing. So he was trying to get away from I mean, there's a lot more. It's quite a complex philosophy he has, but he was trying to get away from the way that a lot of computer vision was going at the time, which was very much about, we have to start from the image and then we have to segment everything in the image and then we have to reconstruct, internally a 3D, a 2.5D sketch and then a 3D model of the image and all that kind of thing. And he was saying that's just not how our perceptual systems work, that instead our perceptual systems are designed and tuned to pick up directly the properties that are relevant to us for action.
Yeah, I suppose these days robotics and neuroscience is closer to this idea of perception and action.
Sometimes, yeah. So again, obviously if you take a robotic approach, it's much easier to you end up having to focus on the affordances, because that's what matters for the robot is, can it act on the world? So you kind of fall into that way of thinking naturally. But having said that, I think there's still a lot of people, even in robotics, who kind of assume, if what you want the robot to do is to pick up a cup, then the first thing you have to do is have it, have stereo vision and a depth camera and reconstruct the entire 3D scene in front of it down to millimeter level with a correct, definition of exactly where the cup is, and then move its hand towards the cup. And that just isn't really how we pick up cups. And it's much more than is necessary, to pick up a cup.
Much more than is necessary, and also a lot less energy efficient than I guess we are. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go into another sort of wacky philosophical question, and then we'll get into the real things. So it's about this question of where is meaning located. And I was reading this paper on the kind of the marriage between Gibson's idea of affordances and neuroscience, and I think the inactivist literature also has this idea. It's that meaning is not located in the external world. It's also not located in some sort of internal model of an agent, but it's sort of in the relational domain between the two. And I was wondering, how does your insects robotic work fit into this? And do insects have meaning in this sense, or do they have meaning at all?
Depends what you mean by meaning, doesn't it? So again, I mean, I would probably fall back on a slightly more pragmatic sense of it, in that there are things that are important to an insect for its survival, and those things are particularly salient to it, for example. So in that sense, things have meaning. It distinguishes things in the world, as being good or bad, or useful or not useful. So if we think of meaning in that, and that is, I guess, a behavioral way of thinking about meaning. So meaning is not something in the head, it's something about, does this actually, in the environment the animal is in, is this thing of importance to that animal? I don't know if that really answers the question, but
yeah, I think it really answers the question. I think we'll also talk about it later more, because we'll talk more about action, and I think distinguishing stimuli, or sort of in a valence sort of sense, I guess that can be meaning in a really basic sense. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a bit about why robotics work can be useful. And your two most cited papers look at the use of robots as models and sort of the theoretical issues with that. And in one of the papers, so typically in the literature, there's this idea that, well, you can use biology to inspire robot engineering, but you sort of flip the question on the head by saying, well, how can we use robots sort of as a research methodology for biology? How can we use robots to test hypotheses in biology? And could you tell us maybe a bit more about this?
Yeah, so I'm often trying to use robots to understand biology. And the reason I do that, or the way I think about that, is that they are just a form of model. And so if you want to understand a biological system, I think it's complex enough that you can't just do it from, hypotheses in your head. You have to implement those hypotheses, and you might implement them as mathematics or as simulations or whatever. But because what you're trying to explain a lot of the time in biology is how this animal interacts with the world, then building a physical system that interacts with the world is a very good way to actually test your hypotheses, to test whether things that you think would work in terms of, perceptual flow or action control, whether they actually work in practice when you're faced with real physics.
You just mentioned simulation, and I think in some of your writing you make the case that simulation is not enough or can't do certain things. Why is a physical model better?
Yeah, so it's not, I tend to push it as that it's better, but I think they're complementary. They have different properties. And I think it's really useful to do both, as it were, to do some things in simulation and to do some things with physical systems, and to try and take the benefit of both. But a simple example I give is that, what I worked on first was a problem of auditory localization. And you could easily have a simulation of, a sound source and the sound emerging from that source and how the amplitude changes with distance and so forth. But if you actually wanted to make it a bit more realistic about how sound propagates in a room and how it echoes and how it gets muffled and all that sort of stuff, it suddenly becomes an extremely complicated simulation. Whereas I could literally, if I had the hypothesis I'm testing is on a robot that has microphones, then I can just put a speaker in a room and, I've already got the real complexity of the auditory world is just given to me for free. So sometimes it's easier to simulate something by the physical thing itself. So that's probably the kind of key place where I think it's important. But the other thing is that it's very easy in a simulation to overlook things. So you include in a simulation what you think is important, and you might overlook something else that you don't realize is important, but is actually quite important as part of how the system works.
Awesome. So the other paper, you set out 7 dimensions to think about robotics models. And just to look at 2 of those dimensions, it's generality and abstraction. And I guess generality is sort of how many biological systems does this model target, like that it tries to explain. And abstraction would be how much biological detail do you try to implement. Typically in the literature, we now have this idea that, well, to generalize, you need to abstract, but you sort of, again, flip it on the head and say, well, a model can be general without being abstract. And actually, you kind of make a case that, at least when you write this in 2001, that robotics built for specific tasks, actually the most successful ones, whilst general purpose ones might have been less successful. Would you say this trend is still accurate now, or has there been a trend towards more general purpose abstracted robotics?
I think in robotics it's still the case that there's more success where people have not tried to be too general. I think in AI that's maybe changed a little bit. So in AI, in the broader field of artificial intelligence, I think people are starting to, people have found a few very effective general purpose methods, and that seem to be able to be applied to a really wide range of things. Whether those are abstract or not is a different question, I think. And I think what I was trying to really address there is there's a strong tendency for people to say, well, I want to explain how animals forage, for example. And if I want to make my explanation general, the best way to do that is to be really abstract about and just, define a distribution of food and assume the animal can move in any direction or something like that. So they make a lot of simplifying assumptions, and they claim that this is making it more general. But my argument is that that's not always the case. Sometimes by doing those assumptions, you're ending up solving a problem that no animal ever is solving. You've just changed the problem completely. So it's no longer general because it doesn't apply to any real system. It's just an abstract problem in itself. So really what I was strongly trying to argue for there was to try and break this assumption that general and abstract go together, because it's quite possible for something to be very general and be true of every biological system living, such as that it's built out of cells. That's a perfectly general thing, but it's not abstract at all. In fact, if we start describing things in terms of cells, we're right down at a very detailed level. So it's trying to break that assumption, because you'll often see the two things kind of put as though they're on the same axes, and I was trying to say they're not necessarily on the same axes.
Yeah, to bridge that to insect robotics or just insects, I guess they are very good at solving really particular problems in their different ecological niches. And how does that fit into this idea of you need biological detail to then have a good sort of general model? Does that make sense? Yeah,
so I can think about that in two ways. So one is the case that, so sometimes the solution that the animal comes up with is actually quite a special purpose solution. So this particular animal has come up with a really good system that solves this particular problem, and that's good. But you can also go the other way and say, well, what's maybe interesting sometimes is to trying to find, across insects, well, what's something that all of them have to do? So you look for a general problem, and then you can start to focus in and say, well, okay, is the solution the same in all these insects? And recently, some of the things that I've been kind of looking at are striking parts of the insect brain that seem to be very common across pretty much every type of insect, even though if you think about it, insects vary hugely in their body structures, in their lifestyles, in their locomotion capabilities, in pretty much every way you can think that something, an animal could be different. Insects are different, but nevertheless these brain structures seem to be very similar and potentially serving a similar purpose for the animal across those things. So there I think you might be getting into quite high generality, but we're actually describing those brain structures at the level of single neurons and circuits. So again, it's not abstract, but it is general.
Yeah, I think the brain regions I guess you're referring to might be the mushroom body, and I'll ask questions about that later. But actually, before we go into insects, I wanted to circle back. You mentioned AI earlier and this trend that maybe they are becoming more abstract or more sort of general, because deep learning or reinforcement learning ideas are applied to robotics, and there are hybrid solutions. Do you sometimes find sort of a clash between the abstractness of, let's say, the AI model and the robotics specific implementation?
So I guess the question kind of ends up being, so you can apply some of these methods, machine learning methods, to anything, and they seem to work better than our other solutions. And it can be a bit frustrating at times when you've spent a lot of time trying to come up with solutions and then find that it seems to just work. But on the other hand, I think particularly with robotics, but probably it's to some extent true, sometimes even though it seems like you're using this same clever method to solve all these problems, often a lot of the solution is in how you set up the problem. So how you collect the training data, what you define as your inputs and outputs, even how you structure your deep network. So there are a number of areas there where, in fact, the deep network is not necessarily doing the work to solve the problem. You've done a lot of groundwork to solve the problem, but then you're leveraging this training method as well. So I'm not sure if I think I've maybe veered away from your question there, but yeah, so I don't think it's not quite as general purpose as it sometimes might seem. As in, it's not like you can just say, okay, this is my problem, I'll just take these methods and apply them and it will work. You have to do a lot of work to structure your problem so that then those methods will give you some advantage.
So I suppose robotics might be better at sort of generalizing across different tasks. So you might train a network to do this very specific thing, but maybe robotics is better if it's just put in the open and it actually is better than solving those sort of new tasks. Let's move on to insect robotics. I think a very famous example where you often cited is your work on crickets, specifically on this idea of cricket phototaxis, which is when a female cricket hears the calling song of a male and tries to locate the male's position. Could you tell us how female crickets do this and how you replicated it in a robot?
Okay, so it's cricket phonotaxis. Phono for sound localization, not phototaxis, which is light. Yeah. Female crickets, so male crickets attract female crickets by calling. Each species will have a distinctive calling song, and then female crickets will find their way to the male crickets. So that was the sort of first robot I built, I guess, and the first insect robot that I studied. And I chose the problem mostly because I was looking for an easy problem where people already knew how it was done, what the neural mechanism was in the insect. So it was a well understood, simple behavior for an insect, and I would start with that and then go on to other things. And of course, once you get into it, you realize it's not as simple as it sounds. And the initial thing that took me a while to figure out, although in fact the people had found the solution, was that a cricket is very small, so its ears are very close together, and the sound that it's listening to is the wavelength of the sound is typically 5 kilohertz, which is, so the length of the wave is about 6 centimeters or so. So what that means is that the mechanisms that we use to get sound direction don't work at all for the cricket. So we hear sound direction partly by the difference in amplitude, because it passes through our head basically to hit the other ear, and also the time difference. But both of those are too minimal for the cricket to do it. So the cricket has this very clever system where its ears are actually connected to each other by an air-filled tracheal tube, which is part of its breathing system. And this means that this is really hard to describe on radio rather than on without that. Normally at this point I would draw a picture, but essentially the way to think about it is that the sound doesn't just reach the eardrum in one direction, it reaches the eardrum both directly and via this tracheal tube, and that means that you're getting two sound sources on either side of the eardrum, which means it actually makes the whole thing directional. So it depends on which direction the sound is coming from, how much the eardrum vibrates. So that was part of the solution. And then I had to kind of build a robot circuit that kind of mimicked this. And then the second part was trying to understand how do they, given that now they have eardrums that tell them, which side has the louder sound, is closer to the sound, then they have to control their turning and they have to filter for the correct pattern. And the solution that I came up with was something that kind of does those two things together. So it's both filtering for the pattern in the sound and then using the output of that filtering to make a decision about which way to turn at any moment. And then I tested it on a robot. And as we discussed a little earlier, one of the things that made it easy to do was to test it in noisy conditions. I actually tested it with recorded cricket song, with artificial cricket song, but then also with real crickets. So I had live crickets in the lab and let the robot find them. So people had argued that, a female cricket might hear several male crickets and it's making a choice between them. So I could just put several different speakers around and see whether my circuit, which didn't have any choice mechanism, would end up at one of the sounds and which sound it would prefer. And that turned out to be the same as what female crickets seemed to prefer, which was kind of the louder and the faster sound. So that showed that it wasn't necessary that they were making a choice, for example.
We might go back a bit to the cricket morphology. We are on a podcast, so it's very difficult to explain something visual as morphology. But if I understand it right, they also receive the auditory signals kind of through their forelegs, their tympani. Then somehow the direction is localized by phase cancellation. Could you maybe explain that, if that's possible?
Okay, so their tympani, which is their eardrums, are on their legs, but they're joined together by this tracheal tube that I mentioned. So this tube that's filled with air that's part of their trachea, which is their breathing system. So what that means is that when the sound is coming from a particular direction, it will hit one of the eardrums from the outside, but it will also come through the tracheal tube and hit that same eardrum from the other side. And the distance that the sound has traveled, the relative distance that the sound has traveled will depend on whether the ear is towards the sound or the tracheal opening is towards the sound. If that's a sort of one way to think about it. So that if your ear is closer to the sound than the tracheal opening, then the sound will be slower coming through. So they're at a different phase, and that phase on the opposite sides of the eardrums might either cancel out or it might increase the vibration of the eardrum. So it gives you a directional signal. And this was actually a principle that was known in engineering previously, so it's called a pressure difference receiver, and it's been used in hearing aids and things. So people knew about the principle, but then it discovered that this seemed to be the principle that actually functions in the ears of the cricket. So I didn't discover this. But I sort of had to rediscover it in a sense of just it wasn't obvious when I started to build a robot that there was any simple solution to this, so I had to kind of jig it up and understand it. And I think it became a little bit famous because I then implemented it, talked about it in the robot and talked to people in AI and adaptive behavior circles about it. It became quite famous as an example of how the physical structure of the animal is solving the problem. So it's not, in our heads, the time difference is being solved by our neural system, is doing computation to try and actually find out, which side is the sound coming from. Whereas here it's completely done physically by the arrangement of the ears on the animal. So then it doesn't require any complex neural processing subsequently. So I think that's why it's been used quite often then as an example in philosophy texts, and I think it's been in a Japanese children's book, and it's been in a whole sort of, it pops up quite often.
Yeah, I suppose in philosophy text about embodied intelligence, because as you said, they're trying to make the case for that the physical aspects is making the work, not necessarily a cognitive process. And I think related to this, you touched upon it briefly, but this idea of this matched filter and it being able to recognize the right sort of frequency and the right crickets from the same species. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about this?
Yes. So one of the key things about how this system works is that it uses this time delay of the sound traveling either directly or indirectly to the eardrum. Exactly how long that time delay is depends on the size, the relative positions of things, and the size of the trachea and so forth. And it seems that that is actually tuned to the pitch of the sound that the insect has to hear. So the cricket wants to hear things at this sort of 5 kilohertz frequency, and the distance the sound has to travel, which is the distance between its ears effectively, is nicely tuned to be best directional response for that particular frequency. And we could show again with the robot, we could just play sounds of different frequencies, and without doing any other kind of filtering for that frequency, we could show that the localization of the robot was best when the frequency kind of matched that particular time delay, which is due to the physical distance.
So again, we have this situation where the cricket doesn't have to like neurally recognize different frequencies, but the morphology does it for it in a sense.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
This is a bit of a weird question, but I was just listening to it this morning. And have you ever listened to cricket chirping slowed down out of curiosity?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I found it sounded very cool. I can recommend it to all of the listeners that it sounds sort of like music. And this is just a really weird comment from my side, but I was actually, so I was reading the cricket paper this morning and I was listening to some sort of weird techno playlist, and I actually realized they had cricket chirps in the background within the music. So I feel like there's interesting demand for cricket music in the world.
There could be something out there, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sort of the other way, because I was doing these studies and some of my subsequent work, my lab, I had a student who was doing work on cricket, on cricket phonotaxis. And so he was playing these sounds and everyone got completely, when you first start playing them, people say, oh, it's quite nice in the lab having some chirping, crickets. Isn't that a nice sound? It's like we're on holiday. And then after several days, they're like, would you please stop that bloody chirping? So, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about your research with ants. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Okay. So we've been quite interested recently in ant navigation. So ants, people have known for a long time that ants are very good at navigating, and in particular, people, when you say ants, they think of chemical trails, but there's a whole set of species of ants that don't use chemical trails, but that instead individual ants can remember where they are relative to their nest. And there's two main types of navigation that they do. So one is called path integration, where they're basically keeping track of their movement and relative to the nest. And the other one is a kind of visual navigation, visual memory, where they actually learn how the world looks around their nest or along particular routes that they're taking, and can follow those again as well. And then even ants that do use chemical trails actually will also use visual memory. And I think it's still a bit unknown to what extent even all ants can do some of this path integration as well. But the ants that we study are particularly good at those two things.
Yeah, this might be very difficult for you to describe without any visual tools, but on the path integration work you have done, you actually have been able to map out actually single cells, sort of what they're doing, and that sort of the vector representation of ants walking, let's say left, right, and how quickly they're walking. All of that, you were able to look at specific cells that code for that, and then think compass neurons that kind of integrate that together. So could you tell us maybe a bit more about that? And it will be really difficult.
Okay, I'll see what I can do again verbally without diagrams. So it's been known for a long time that ants use cues from the sky as compass cues. So the most obvious one is the sun, but actually they also use polarized light, which can actually be a bit more reliable, and you can get a more kind of accurate estimate. So they know which direction they're facing. And then other experiments have shown that they record how fast they're moving, probably through counting their steps or through their step movement. For other insects, it might be through optic flow. So if you know your speed and you know your direction, then you can kind of integrate those two things together to as your velocity, and that will kind of let you keep track of where you are. So what we were looking at was a circuit in the central brain. Well, I like to say, it's a circuit that's called the central complex in the brain of insects because it's in the center and it's complex. But it's basically a very ordered circuit that seems to have has 8 cardinal directions, which are the 8 kind of compass points, and then for each direction it sums up this input about the speed at which it's moving, so that it kind of sums that up in 8 different directions, and that together represents a vector, which is the vector to go back home again. And what we could show is that from detailed anatomy and recordings in insects, that we could really show how this circuit could perform this function in a very plausible way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Often when I talk with my friends about insects, I hear this argument that, well, insects, they only have instincts, and maybe a better word than instincts might be this idea of a perception, action, reflex loop. But basically the idea is they don't have any complex behavior, but some of your work has shown that they can do multimodal sensory integration, which might be, for example, the visual memory integration and the path integration in ants, or they might have a memory and learning. And you mentioned the central complex, and another area you have looked at is the mushroom body. And could you tell us a bit about this sort of work and whether insects just have instincts or whether there's something more?
Okay, so the short answer is insects definitely learn, and we know that for sure. So that it's not just instinctual. And then I think the other question is, you sort of said, well, another way to think about it is sensory motor reflexes or something. So I think it's also the case that even without memory and learning, they also have often quite complicated calculations going on between the sensing and the motor. It's not like it's a really simple feedback system. There's often something difficult. So what I just described, where I said, the path integration, the animal has to kind of keep in its head, it's summing up all the time which direction it's going and using that to control where it goes. I mean, that is obviously, that's more complicated than a simple sensory motor reflex already. But we've also studied quite a lot the memory. So I mentioned the visual memory of ants. So this is when ants, for example, will stop and look back at their nest when they're leaving their nest, and they appear to learn what the visual surroundings look like, because then if later on you pick them up from somewhere and put them somewhere else so that they can't use this path integration, they should be lost. They can still, if they can see something familiar, then they'll be able to follow it to get back to their nest. And obviously they can do this, wherever their nest happens to be. They can't have pre-learnt what the world is like. They have to have learnt it themselves. And if you change the world, if while they're in the nest, you go and cut down some bushes and change the world, when they come out, they'll look around again and stop and learn the new arrangement of things, so that they then have that information available. So in that sense, we know they learn. But there's a lot of other kinds of learning experiments people have done on insects for a long time. The majority, or the kind of the most popular methods are giving them odors. So you will give them an odor that might initially be a neutral odor that they don't particularly like or dislike, and then you pair that odor with an electric shock or with some nice sugar, and then they'll change their behavior to the odor. And so that kind of learning has been known, for a very long time. And one reason I kind of mention that is because when we want to understand how insects learn, the visual learning maybe is more impressive, but it's harder to investigate than some of these simpler forms of learning. We tend to kind of go between those two systems sometimes. So we might use, for example, fruit flies or even maggots, so baby fruit flies, as the kind of model system to try and understand the mechanisms of learning, where we're looking at this kind of olfactory association. But we then try and generalize that to say, well, could the same circuits be doing the kind of more complex visual memory that the ants have to have?
You mentioned visual memory is really difficult to study. And I think the work that is done in mammals, it's often people discuss the Morris water maze task, which is when you put a mice or rat in water and they try to swim to some sort of platform that is hidden, and they use visual cues to orient themselves. That processing happens in the hippocampus, which insects don't have. But I think you have written that the mushroom bodies have some sort of similar structures. They have pinion cells. How does this visual memory navigation compare to, let's say, the ants, which you also put in a sort of a similar Morris water maze task, just not in the water, but in a...
Yeah. Okay. So we did... Yeah, so we actually we tested crickets, and other people have tested flies in an equivalent thing where instead of being in water, the insect is on a hot plate, basically, so it wants to escape, which the same as the rat in the water wants to escape. And instead of having a platform under the water, we have a cool spot that the insect can find, but it can't see or sense in any other way apart from actually finding it. And then you have surrounding visual cues, and you see whether the animal can use those visual cues and learn from the visual cues to find its way back there faster. So someone quite a while ago showed that cockroaches could do it, and then we showed crickets could do it, and then someone after us showed that flies could do it. Our working hypothesis is that the memory that happens in the mushroom body is actually a memory that it could be for olfaction, but it could also be for vision. It could be for multimodal cues. It's really what it does in general. And here we're back to this kind of general purpose solution, is that it takes some pattern of sensory input, encodes it as what we call a sparse pattern. So a pattern where out of a very large number of neurons, only a few of them fire, and that kind of encodes that really specific input. And then you memorize that particular sparse pattern as something that was important, or you associate it with good things, or you associate it with bad things, or you associate it with, turning left or turning right or something like that. So you make some kind of association with that sensory pattern so that if you experience that sensory pattern again, you have some idea what you should do in relation to that sensory pattern. And one thing that's nice about this sparse pattern is that it means you can store lots and lots of different things. So for example, in the model we built for the visual memory, we could show that you could store 100 different visual memories in this neural array without them interfering with each other, so that you could remember each of those 100 things very efficiently.
I'm going to ask you another impossible question now based off this. So do insects have an internal model of the words, or do they have consciousness?
All right. So for the first one, an internal model of the world, I think they do, but it depends how complex that model is a different question. So I think even relatively simple behaviors often need some kind of knowledge, some kind of internal model. And the classic example here, and one that we've looked at a little bit, is that if you turn towards, say you hear a sound and you turn towards it, then your whole visual world will change really quickly. And normally you'd have a reflex that if your whole visual world has changed, you'd think this is bad and I need to turn, I need to stop this thing from happening. But if you're turning to a sound you heard, you know that the visual world should change. You're predicting that the visual world should change. So you take into account the fact that the visual world should change. And even crickets, so female crickets turning towards the sound of a male cricket seem to know that they need to ignore the visual motion that they experience when they make that turn. So in that sense, they have to have an internal model of what should happen in the world when they make a turn. So that's kind of the simplest form of internal model. It probably, for insects, I think it gets more elaborate than that, but maybe not much more elaborate than that. So it's not like they can mentally simulate what's going to happen 3 days from now, or if I do this to this other ant, will that other ant then do this to this other, so complex mental simulations that we can experience. It's not clear at all that ants or other insects can do that. Some people might disagree as to how clever they are, but I think that might be limited. So, and then I think it's for consciousness, it then depends on, what you think consciousness is. But if you think it's, mental simulation and maybe even an awareness of mental simulation, then I think it is maybe a level of complexity that you can say corresponds to consciousness. But one reason I study insects is so that I can avoid the consciousness question. Because I don't really need to think about that to understand what they're doing.
Right. On the avoiding the consciousness question, sort of often the implications with animal consciousness research is sort of how do we treat them? And there's this saying, you wouldn't harm a fly. So if you walk through the forest and if someone walks through the forest and they might walk on an ant, then they might think, oh, oops, but they might not think too much about it. Now you have studied insect robotics for a couple of decades. Is that any different when you accidentally step on an ant? Is there then that sort of regret? Or...
Yes, in a short answer, I find myself now, if I see an insect that formerly I might have just crushed or whatever, a nasty mosquito or something. Now I'm much more inclined to think, it's amazing, what an amazing little machine this thing is, isn't it incredible? And feel quite bad about actually just crushing it. Yeah.
Right. So you also just mentioned that predicting one's own sensory or motor input. We'll talk about that in a second, but we are on a podcast about embodied AI, and maybe what could be some takeaways? What could we learn from cricket ants, fruit flies, or their robotic counterparts? What could we learn from embodied AI?
Right. So there's different ways you could take that question. I think one thing we could learn that we've already touched on a little bit, is that quite often from insects you can see that the way their sensory system is designed, or the way their whole body is designed, is to some extent solving the perceptual problem that they have, or the sensory motor problem that they have to solve is often solved partly by the physical arrangement of their bodies. So in that sense, I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, including for robotics, that maybe sometimes you don't need smarter algorithm, you just need a smarter sensor, and that will suddenly open up a whole set of possibilities for what you're able to do. So I think that would be one lesson I would take away. And now I've forgotten what I was going to say for the other ones. I guess the other one is that, if you want to build intelligent robots, that means building systems that interact with the world. That's, the essence of it. That's where it's different from just AI, kind of disembodied AI. And to do that, looking at animals is a really good idea, because they're solving a lot of the problems that we still can't solve very well with robots. And if we're going to look at animals, then insects have the advantage that they're a bit easier to understand what's going on in them without them being any less capable of getting around in the world. So if you want to understand how an animal, gets through a complex thing, or climb stairs, or I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, something that I'm working on now, which is how animals grasp objects. So we really want robots to be able to grasp objects, but they're not very good at it. So maybe we can take inspiration from biology, but insects are very, very good at grasping objects. So we can do experiments on them that we wouldn't want to do with monkeys, for example, and we can understand what's going on in their brain mechanisms because they have smaller brains. So insects are quite useful as a kind of inspiration in that sense.
Yeah, on the smaller brain side, I think I'm sort of paraphrasing you, but I think you have said how much we can learn from how little brain. And I think that's a really good way to put it, because there's less brain. You can look at the whole system and you don't have to necessarily abstract, but you can also learn so much because the behavior is really intelligent. Now let's get on to the predictive coding. So in 2004, you wrote a paper about insects and whether they have forward models, which is basically this idea of, can they sort of predict their sensory input or predict their motor actions? In the last 2 decades, there has been an explosion in the predictive coding literature. So how does your current insect robotics work fit into this? And I guess we have already talked about it, but maybe you could have a bit more to say.
I mean, I think what I already said a little bit about prediction kind of covers it. And I guess the extent to which, what kinds of prediction is going on, and the extent to which maybe, I think what people have thought about a lot more recently is how, the prediction maybe reaches all the way down into the sensing system. So you can't really understand what the sensing system is doing without assuming that it's also getting inputs that have relevance to prediction. So I think that's probably, in a way, that's probably been less explored in insects. So I think people still tend to explore insect sensory systems from a very kind of feed-forward point of view. But I think it's sure to be relevant to bring that into account. I'm trying to think where I stand on. I mean, I know very well, for example, Andy Clark's work on predictive coding and the philosophical consequences and so on. But I'm trying to think whether mechanistically, if I'm trying to solve a problem mechanistically, has this made a difference to how I'm approaching the problems? And I think beyond what I said already about, if you're going to understand how sensory systems interact and how an animal does something while it's trying to do lots of other things, it's bound to need prediction. But I don't think otherwise it's had a kind of direct influence on the way that I approach the problems.
So this next question is about sort of how we can use the robotics literature to help the AI literature. In 2019, you co-wrote a paper about reinforcement learning with Tianchi Wei. And before we get into the paper, I sort of have like two explanatory questions to talk about, two concepts, so we can kind of break it down and we understand the third question better. So first, in most neural networks, backpropagation is used to update the weights. And so in the paper, you explain that for backpropagation to work, the network needs to be A, in time invariant, and B, differentiable. So why is that, and how does this compare to the brain?
Yeah, it's not easy to explain, but essentially, I mean, you need a continuous function to apply standard backpropagation. And so if you have a spiking network, it's quite hard to say how, for example, spiking neurons could have the kind of properties that you would assume in a backpropagation learning mechanism.
Okay, let's get on to the second question. What are central pattern generators?
So this is a concept that's been around in biology for a while, which is that things, many behaviors are rhythmic, such as walking, running, breathing, etc. And people have found circuits in various parts of the nervous system that seem to have intrinsic oscillation. So that means basically if you take it out of the animal, it still shows this kind of oscillation property, and that they assume this is a pattern that's being generated by that circuit that then is what's kind of at least partially producing the rhythmic behavior as the output. I should maybe put a little caveat here that I've actually done some work on systems where people say there are central pattern generators, say there have to be central pattern generators, and shown that you don't have to have a central pattern generator because of embodiment. So if you have the right kind of embodiment, sometimes these intrinsic rhythms can actually arise through the embodiment rather than necessarily through an internal pattern generator. But there are examples that probably are fairly convincing of neural circuits that have this property.
What's an example where the CPG sort of emerges from the embodiment?
So this is work we've done on crawling behavior in maggots again. And here it's essentially because if you assume the body has springy dynamics, then it has kind of intrinsic oscillation in it. And if you connect it up the right way, and if you just kind of have a simple feedback that, for example, when a segment contracts, then the neural system contracts it even more. And if the segments are connected to each other in a springy body, then you actually automatically start to get this patterned movement out. Again, it's a little difficult to explain without pictures. But we're not the only people who have suggested this. So there are various suggestions. Even for walking, your legs are a pendulum physically. So there's a certain intrinsic oscillation that might happen there. And maybe all you need to do is just kind of, if you can just emphasize. If you can just feed back, that oscillation that would happen naturally to basically compensate for the loss of energy that happens, through friction or whatever, then you can get a rhythm that will continue. So there's nice examples in robotics of what are called passive walkers, which are robots that walk without any motors. And just use a simple slope, which is a bit of gravity to give them some energy, and then otherwise they're just using the kind of the intrinsic pendulum properties of the legs to do a very nice walking behavior.
It would be easier to explain with visual tools. There are a lot of great YouTube videos of talks you have given where you have used sort of video diagrams to explain how, I don't know, sort of on like a graph level, how with behavior something changes, or lots of good examples. I'll make sure to link a few of those in the description so people can have some visual understanding as well. But now let's get onto the paper by you and Tianqi. And if I understand the paper correctly, the idea is that instead of updating the weights normally through backpropagation, you and your colleague came up with this learning rule, which would sort of produce spontaneous weight dynamics. And then these weight dynamics would be updated through a control system. And this control system was sort of inspired by a CPG, a central pattern generator. And could you talk us through these steps A and B and how the paper looked like?
The essential idea is that instead of, so that we think that synapses have properties that mean that the weight of a synapse, the effective weight of a synapse, which is basically related to the number of receptors, is something that maybe is not as stable as people tend to think, and that it's actually a very dynamic system that's changing all the time. So we kind of model this to create a kind of chaotic dynamics so that it's moving. And so what you can think about is that then the weight is kind of exploring a parameter space. And if you have several weights across a neural network, then collectively they're exploring a whole kind of state space. And then the idea was, okay, then if you want to learn something, you want to learn where those weights should be sitting in this state space. So the learning rule essentially says when you get reward, then you should change the dynamics of these oscillating weights to go closer to whatever value they were at when that reward happened, as it were. So you gradually, the weights will drift in the direction of the one that gets you the most reward, and they'll also stop oscillate. The range of oscillation will also decrease, so that you gradually kind of stabilize on a better solution. So it's a little bit like you're trying to just explore the space and find the right solution. But it turns out that it works quite well. And one reason, so what we applied it to a system that kind of combined a CPG and also some spiking characteristics and so forth. So what we wanted to demonstrate was that you could use it in training a network that would be very hard to train by standard backpropagation, because it had recurrent loops in it, it had CPGs in it, which are small little oscillatory circuits. So it had all these various components that there's really no obvious way to train with standard methods. But you could use this method to train the weights to solve a particular task.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I think in the paper, it'll be in the description, there's a really good graph which sort of shows the sinusoidal waves and how the weight space goes up as the central pattern generator rhythm goes up. But I guess the graph explains it much better than I could. So let's get onto a career question. So today you're a world expert in insect robotics. And one of the reasons for this is that you're already exploring this when it was still in its infancy and when it was sort of in between traditional disciplines, because there was biology, there was robotics, but there wasn't really in between. And could you tell us a bit about the challenges of being in between disciplines, what it takes to establish a new methodology or a new field?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, people have done bio-inspired robotics for a long time, because it's pretty obvious if you're building a robot that an animal is doing it better than your robot. So it's not like it's completely new, but it's also true that, in general, people who study biology and people who study robotics do not interact very much. They tend to be very separate fields. So even though people have been inspired, but quite often they don't take, so people in robotics who say I'm inspired by biology don't always take the biology very seriously. They'll take a very high level or very, a slightly naive view of what the biology is doing rather than studying it in detail. And what's certainly being different from what I do is also, not just that I really get into the biology, but that I try and answer the biological question with the robot. So that was probably what was most novel about the work that I was doing. And yeah, so it does have the consequence that you're not really a biologist or a roboticist, and that has good points and bad points. One advantage is that people remember you. So if you're at a robotics conference and you show videos of ants, or vice versa, if you're at a biology conference and you show videos of robots, people remember you. And so I think that's, from a career perspective, people have been able to say, yes, she's the insect robotics person. That's pretty unique and special. So I think that has been helpful in a way to have my kind of be unique in that way. I mean, I'm not the only person who does this, but it's certainly not typical. I think the disadvantage is working out, where are you going to have as your academic home? So are you going to be in a biology department, or are you going to be in a robotics department? And also, well, again, which conferences do you go to? Should you go to robotics conferences or biology conferences? Or should you indeed, as is an option, there are biorobotic conferences, as it were. There are conferences for people who want to do this kind of interaction, and even journals and so forth that kind of focus on that. So at some point, sometimes you have to make a decision and say, well, if it comes to a push, I'm really in this field or that field. If you can make it work for you, is in a way to have your academic home, as in, I'm in a school of informatics, in the field that's actually the one that maybe a little bit less about, because that's what you're doing then, is surrounding yourself with people who do know more about that. So basically, it can be really helpful from that perspective to be able to I can keep up with informatics just kind of by being in that environment. And then I can be actively finding out about the biology by going and talking, to people in biology departments or going to biology conferences and so forth. So you have to be a bit strategic about it. And I think the other thing I'd say is it's important not to become too much of a specialist in the sense of so not, for example, to say, okay, well, insect robotics is really interesting. Let's found a journal in insect robotics for all the people who work on that area. I mean, we could do that. There's enough people probably to have a journal. But the problem is then no one in insect research and no one in robot research will read that journal. Whereas if you're doing good work, if I'm doing good work, then it should be work that's interesting both to people in robotics and to people in biology. And I should be able to send it to a biological journal or a robotics journal and get it published. And it just keeps you to a higher standard, I think, if you still try to influence the mainstream field, even though you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I can really appreciate that last point, because I guess I'm doing an embodied AI podcast and I want to reach people in, general AI or neuroscience who are not already convinced by the whole embodiment literature. Mm-hmm. But I guess on being the odd one out at a conference, that must be really difficult, because you need to, if you are in a robotics conference, then most of the people have a lot of tacit knowledge and you don't need to explain, let's say, what a central pattern generator is. How do you, this issue of science communication and small amounts of time, what are some useful things you do to explain things to people who are not from that field?
That's a good question. Practice a lot, I guess. And I think partly realize that even people who should have the tacit knowledge maybe don't have it at their fingertips. So often, you might go to a conference and people will talk about, they'll just assume everybody knows this and they'll give the talk. And they don't just lose, the few people in the audience who don't know that. They often lose people who do kind of know about that stuff, but not in the level of detail that these people have assumed, or they can't follow it at the speed that these people have assumed. So the fact that you kind of know that you're talking, if you make the assumption people don't need things explained a bit, then usually you're going to keep more of the audience with you, I think, even if it is a specialist audience to some extent.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that. I'd say that I'm just an undergraduate and I don't know anything pretty much, but there are some speakers who really are great at starting from zero and explaining it all the way to what are they currently doing to advance the field, and them starting from zero and explaining all the concepts and all the assumptions and how their approaches work. Those are really the talks I enjoy. So the final question always looks to the future. So you already mentioned this project Graphs. So it started in October, and it's quite a big project, a 5-year project, where you look at how insects manipulate objects and how that might be translated into robotics. Could you tell us a bit about this project?
Yes, so this project got inspired by the fact we do field studies on ants, and we were doing ant navigation field studies, which involved training ants to a feeder, and then once they knew the route to the feeder, we would pick them up and do a test, move them somewhere else to do a test. So, and you paint the ants so that you know which ant has been how many times to the feeder. And so the upshot of this is you spend a lot of your time staring at a feeder while ants come up and take food and go back, and you're just sitting there because you're waiting for the blue one to come back, and so while I was doing that, it just occurred to me, well, these ants are coming in and we were feeding them cookie crumbs, and they come in and they have a bunch of cookie crumbs and it's a bit messy and everything else, but they're very, very good at very quickly picking up a cookie crumb of a very different size, very irregular shape. I can just grab it and carry it back to their nest. And I thought, well, how are they doing that? That's interesting. And then I also thought, as far as I know, this is something that robots are not super good at, picking up unknown objects, particularly if it's cluttered, particularly if they're irregular, they can't have any kind of preconceived model of what the shape of the object is. So looking into it a little bit more, it seems, this really is, it's a problem that people are working on in robotics, and there are some solutions to, but not really very effective solutions. And there are a lot of applications for robots that would be much, much improved if we could actually do this. So one that I'm particularly interested in is the idea that we might be able to use robots to do something like litter clearing. So, remove plastic from beaches or something like that. But we know for sure we don't have robots that could do that kind of thing. So I thought, well, if ants can do it with their tiny brains, and they have most of their grasping is done with their mandibles, which are just, their mouth parts, which is just a very simple gripper. It's like a simple robot gripper. It's not like a complex human hand or anything. But they're still extremely good at picking things up. So I thought, well, it would be nice to study that. So that's essentially what we're doing. So we're going to have ants in the lab, and we're going to have objects, and we're going to try and film them from lots of different directions, so we can try and reconstruct exactly what they do when they pick up an object. And then try and test that out on robot models.
That's really interesting. You also reminded me of a really nice thought. Over the holidays, with some friends, we were eating breakfast always at this table outside, and we had an ant colony really close by, and we would always be so impressed by how massive of an object these ants were able to carry, and it just made us very happy in the mornings. I noticed that for your GRASS project, I think you got 2 open positions for people you're hiring. Could you maybe tell us about that? Maybe some of the listeners might find your work and maybe the position really interesting.
Yeah, so I should say that the positions for that specific project are now filled, but I do actually have 2 more positions open for postdoctoral researchers, which could be linked to this project, but more specifically, they're looking at some of the circuits in the brain that we talked about before. So one of them is looking at how insects learn in the mushroom body circuit, and one of them is looking at the navigation capabilities and this central complex circuit. So both of those are jobs that are open at the moment. I think applications close in early April, and I'd be, if people have found this interesting and think they might like to work in this area, I'd be very happy to hear from them.
Yeah, this has been so interesting. Thanks for taking the time, Barbara.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to stay updated when the next episode is coming out, please follow the Twitter or LinkedIn account in the description. I aim to publish at least 1 episode every month. Have a nice day.